Welcome to Washington in Focus, your source for the week's top stories in the state of Washington. I'm Cole Lauterbach, managing editor for the Center Square Newswire service. This week, we'll be discussing Washington behind on climate goals set by Governor Jay Inslee, more trouble with the Attorney General's police use of force database, concerns over Seattle's lack of transparency in their urban planning, and Spokane's firefighters having their busiest year ever. That's ahead on Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach. Now, let's jump into the headlines. Governor Jay Inslee has built his brand on environmentalism. The Green governor has set ambitious goals for the state's emissions, then just stopped releasing data showing whether it's reaching that goal. Capitol correspondent Carlene Johnson covered the latest data dump. What was the public data that the state revealed?
Yeah, so the Department of Ecology did finally release numbers, which they haven't for the last couple of years, but the numbers that we got are a few years old. So what they released were emissions for the state of Washington, for greenhouse gas emissions for the state of Washington for 2020 and 2021. So they said total state greenhouse gas emissions dipped 13.8% in 2020. And then emissions went back up 8.8% for 2021. But you got to remember, I think we all remember, we'll never forget what was happening in 2020.
Right.
Everybody's
the entire economy shut down. Exactly. I mean, that's pretty, there should be an asterisk on every bit of data from 2020, even 2021 to that extent, in states that kept everything closed. Why the delay? I mean, and aren't they bound by law to release this stuff in a much more timely fashion? I mean, it's obviously important data for them, right?
Yeah, it's in state law what the law says is that by December 31st of each even numbered year, starting way back in 2010, which of course ending 2024, which we just did, that was an even numbered year. Ecology is supposed to and also the Department of Commerce, in conjunction with them, are supposed to report greenhouse gas emissions for the preceding 2 years. So what we should have gotten at the end of 24 were emissions numbers for 22 and 2023. Those are not included. And Ecology has not been giving good answers for that delay. I spoke with Todd Myers at Washington Policy Center. He's the vice president for research, but used to head up their Center for the Environment. He's still their big, environment policy guy. And his suggestion is that Ecology hasn't been releasing the data because if they do release timely data, it's going to prove that their policies and the billions of taxpayer dollars on all these green projects are not actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions as promised. So it would sort of be an admission of failure, in his opinion, and that's why we don't have current data.
Well, and that could hint as to why Governor Inslee in recent months has moved away from the term emissions and has started using pollution as a talking point. Our investigative reporter, TJ Martinell, has reported on that a couple times now after noticing that trend of kind of the little bit of shift in lingual gymnastics there. But when you talk, you mentioned the data from 2022 and 2023 should be out by now. That is something that Todd keyed in on in your story, that they're supposed to be using this data to make these policy decisions moving forward. And without recent data, this is largely useless.
He explained to me, Todd Myers, explained to me in detail. He said, it's really not that hard to calculate this data. It's a bunch of number crunching, right? And you have to make sure you've got accurate data, but EPA releases information. EPA has released state level, emissions up through 2023. So we're way behind. It's basically transportation is the big culprit for greenhouse gas emissions, right? So you go in and you look at how much fuel consumption, diesel consumption, and natural gas use there is in the state. Well, they can get that information pretty readily, crunch the numbers and go, okay, like for 2020, for example, hardly anybody was going anywhere because we were told to stay home. So that's why those, numbers dipped so dramatically in 2020. But the concession here from ecology, really by omission of the current data, is that if we release the numbers for 2022 and 2023, they're not meeting the goals. And the bigger issue for all of Washington taxpayers then, Cole, is that we've got these goals that we have to meet per Governor Inslee for 2030 and then up to 2050. And if we're not anywhere close to that, Washington residents are going to be told that we have to make drastic cuts to emissions to meet those goals because we're nowhere near being on target to meet those. So that's the real issue here. If we don't know that we're getting close and we're not meeting those year by year or coming close and we don't have current data, then we are going to be told in the coming years that we're way off track. We're going to have to make some drastic changes or more tax dollars put towards these greenhouse projects.
If they're bound by law to do it, but there's obviously no enforcement mechanism, there's no misdemeanor for the governor or anything like that. Typically what you see is if in like what we had seen with the initiative, I believe it was 2066, the gas initiative, where it's now law, someone had to sue to get them to comply with. My next question then becomes, is there going to be an organization that could either be a business organization that thinks that, okay, well, we're being, they're obscuring this data for political reasons, or an environmental group that would stand to think you need to have this released promptly so that we can make proper policy decisions for the environment. I wonder if one side or the other is going to find themselves in front of a judge and drag the state in and say, listen, you have to turn this stuff over.
No, you're 100% right.
I think it'll turn up one way or another sooner than they probably want it to. Right. So it should be very interesting to cover, and rest assured, I'm sure you'll be there waiting for it. Thank you, Carlene. Washington's police use of force database is mired in years of controversy. The point of the information is to track and make public anytime law enforcement uses lethal or less than lethal force on someone, in the spirit of the George Floyd killing at the hands of police in 2020. Investigative reporter TJ Martinell has found yet another wrinkle with the rollout. TJ, where does the latest snag lie?
The biggest problem is they're attempting to collect what's called computer-aided dispatch data, known as CAD, from 911 dispatch centers. And the problem is that there's been concerns raised in the past, and it appears to be ongoing with these dispatch centers about whether or not this is legal for them to do, because some of the information is protected by federal law and they are not allowed to share it, because if they share it with Washington State University, it becomes public subject of public disclosure.
Spoilable. Right. So the 911 center told the university sharing their emergency data, the CAD data, might be illegal, or of their opinion, it is illegal. Now, what does that mean for the database? Is that a must-have for them, or are they going to have to rely on other data that might be more dated or more laborious to come about?
That's what's really intriguing, is that none of the CAD data is not authorized in the state law that called for this database, and it's not part of the advisory group's recommendation. So they're trying to seek information that's not even found in state law, or that they're not required to. And so these dispatch centers are not legally required to turn over this data anyways. And so it's creating this very weird situation where they're trying to get information, they're trying to get data that they are not legally required to go seek out. And they're trying to get from people and organizations that feel legally bound to withhold that information.
So the AGO, the Attorney General's office, currently staffed by Governor-elect Ferguson, explained to these organizations not to use that data, right? They told Wazoo, don't use that. You can't use it.
Yeah. So the Attorney General's office policy director told the Washington State University to stick with the data elements that were in the advisory group's recommendations and not to go beyond that. And this email came before he was reaching. So after this email, he then proceeded to reach out to at least one dispatch center for this data that was outside of the advisory group's recommendations. So
he did it anyway.
Yeah. He did appeal the Attorney General's office's conclusions, but they said, you know what, we're kind of done having this conversation. It's almost in a very polite way is what they said. You know, as this program moves forward, we are happy to revisit this conversation. That's literally what they wrote. The database should have been up by now, and I don't know if they collected any data. And when I reached out to Washington State University, the professor leading this project, I don't believe any dispatch center has shared any of this data with their project.
You said one of them was told that they were authorized to do it. Was it?
Yeah.
Somebody somewhere said, yeah, go ahead, share the data.
One law enforcement agency did authorize the dispatch center to share the data, and that dispatch center told Washington State University, no, we're not sharing it. It would be potentially illegal. So on the surface, a law enforcement agency authorized something to occur that is in violation of federal law.
This database is just cursed. I'm telling you, everyone who gets a hold of it, it's just bad stuff keeps happening around it. But but thank you, TJ. Appreciate it. And we'll look forward to follow-ups on this story. City planning for a metro like Seattle is not a short-term brainstorm session. It's years of deliberate decision-making on things that will have a profound impact on residents decades after the plans are initially struck. Seattle reporter Spencer Pauly covered one city council member's concerns with their city's comprehensive plan. First, though, Spencer, would you do us a favor and explain what type of planning goes into this thing?
Sure. So a city's comprehensive plan essentially just serves as a roadmap for how the city will grow over the next 20 years, as you kind of alluded to here. Now, the city is required to update this plan every 10 years or so with a priority of addressing the ongoing housing crisis specifically for Seattle. Now, this is an issue that, everyone's basically aware of here, that there's a lack of affordable housing. So this comprehensive plan is very sacred to the city council. I think we can look back to last year in 2024, where City Council member Tammy Morales proposed a zoning incentive for affordable housing projects, but that bill was rejected because the other Seattle City Council members said this bypasses the 20-year plan and creates a divided system. So a lot of city officials look to this plan to say we have to align with this and go with the goal we set in 20 years from now.
So this becomes a pretty authoritative kind of charter where, people will say, we're not doing this because it does not abide by this. It misaligns with this. Now, what is the council member questioning in terms of what they're trying to put in?
So the Seattle City Council member we're talking about here is Maritza Rivera, and she's questioning the Office of Planning and Community Development, who is in charge of the plan, and their process in developing this update. Like I said, this update is required every 10 years just because, cities change in 10 years. We're seeing Seattle, what it looks like in 2025 is different than what it looked like in 2015, et cetera. So what is happening is Rivera saying we are rushing the process here of, updating this plan. And there's a lack of community involvement. She says that public's not able to provide enough feedback to influence the plan. Now, I will say, Cole, it was interesting to watch this meeting on Monday here. It looks like public feedback is a little misinformed, perhaps, or they're going a different direction. For instance, during public comment, residents were arguing that more housing construction will lead to less trees to filter polluted air. And they even alluded to the fact that more construction of housing led to the death of an orchid calf that happened recently in the city of Seattle, over in the Puget Sound. This is all kind of interesting, and I think goes back to the fact that maybe the office can do more to educate the public on what this plan exactly does.
Public comment's going to be public comment. I mean,
That's
obviously some people are better informed than others, and, you just hope for the best and hope they leave their tin hat at the door. But in terms of, what she's questioning, it sounds like she thinks the city's doing its homework the night before the project's due here, or trying to obscure things because they're doing something that they might get a lot of negative public feedback on.
Yeah, that's exactly the right way to describe it, Cole. Is doing the homework the night before, it's due. The office transmitted its final legislation to the city council, just after closing public comment on any zoning changes, a part of the plan on December 20th. And then you had the holiday in between then and now. And so it is, that's a lot. That's the time when people are leaving, traveling, not able to kind of look and educate themselves on the plan and say how they want their communities and neighborhoods to be impacted. Do they want to allow these apartment buildings to be created in their neighborhoods, or, other aspects of the plan? Now, another thing that Rivera has said that the office isn't doing is, showing its plans for how transportation, utilities, and climate resilient needs are going to be addressed as part of this plan. Like I said, the comprehensive plan is more so prioritizing the housing crisis, but these are other aspects. And basically the office said, well, as of Monday, when this was a concern, it's available now, but already we're having the city council look at this and trying to influence the plans. But, I think Rivera would still say we still need to hear more from the public and the community, not so much just the city council.
Yeah. Like a little late in the day for this to suddenly become public. Now, with these long-term planning documents, one thing that it reminds me of when you talk about the, 20-year, 10-year plan and little tiny alterations having a big effect. If the city, the governing body, messes something up in these plans for, lack of proper vetting, a city official said that's a January problem when it, before it became a December problem. How expensive, could it potentially be to undo the effects? Because when in California with high-speed rail, when they were just doing these economic impact studies, a couple wrong, plots or, areas or addresses, and you're looking at millions of dollars in wasted effort.
It just reminds me, too, of Sound Transit here, where they're trying to expand their region of transportation, through the light rail over to the East King County and whatnot. They keep delaying these projects, and that adds millions and millions more. And that's what's going to happen here when you dedicate so much funding to housing and zoning laws and incentives and whatever have you there in that regard. What you're going to see is an issue where you can have so much money into housing, apartment zoning. And then what happens when that's not going to address the issue? What happens when maybe public safety becomes such a concern? That's why people are not coming into Seattle, or maybe they're moving out and we're losing revenue from these people that were supposed to be here. And so the zoning, the comprehensive plan changes in that regard. Well, we wanted to add over 330,000 homes by 2035, 2045. And then what happens when no one's moving in? What do you have to do to adjust the plan? And already millions have been spent and, looking at data and all of these statistics and whatever ways to address the issue. And then we're just going to scrap that all and restart again and spend millions more on a problem that's persisting and never being addressed.
Interesting and terrifying at the same time. Thank you, Spencer. When a business has its highest activity year, it's called for celebration. When a fire department has its busiest year ever, it typically means trouble. Spokane's department has said as much this week, and Eastern Washington reporter Tim Klauser covered it. How much more busy was SFD than they were the year prior, Tim?
Well, Cole, Fire Chief Julio Berg said it was her department's busiest year on record, but she didn't provide many annual comparisons or total call volume. So it's hard to say how much exactly they were busier than 2023. One thing to consider, though, is that the city didn't have a fire academy last year, and they currently have 18 vacancies, driving up overtime for other uniformed firefighters. She did add that response times are down for November and December as call volumes are up, though again, she didn't note the total volume. But she did add that the response times, though they were down for November and December, she said looking across the board, she thinks that it is down overall compared to 2023 as well. But with these empty positions and limited funding for overtime as well, the department is stretched thin in areas, especially when responding to the homeless and fentanyl crises in the city, which they're frequently dealing with.
I mean, it sounds great that they're doing more with less, faster. That makes for a pretty compelling message. It seems odd that they would have fewer people and more calls and be able to do it more quickly, which is peculiar. But what are the reasons for all of these uptick in calls this year, did you say?
Just before the fire chief gave her presentation, the police chief, Kevin Hall, actually gave another presentation to the city council where he provided a wealth of data. One statistic saw arrests increase by 20% in 2024 compared to 2023. And that includes citations, a lot of which are for people or offenses related to homelessness, which the fire department also deals with. The police chief added, unlawful calls related to unlawful camping increased by 145% last year. DOA calls went up 16%, reaching 609 in 2024. So it's considerable. The fire department, police, local service providers regularly respond to these incidents of people in crises living on the streets and often in the state of overdose. On Monday, the county's medical examiner told me that they've recorded 338 overdoses so far for 2024. They expect more to come in. So the firefighters are having to administer more Narcan than usual, particularly downtown where they see the most overdoses.
I mean, and also it leads me to wonder, too, with all the added police calls for homelessness, if maybe people are calling now because they know that because of Prop 1, there's a lot of places where these people will get arrested and they should be moved instead of just, a policeman showing up and shuffling them off 2 blocks down so they can move right back over. That's one thing you see in metropolitan areas where people, if they don't think the police are one, or if they think they're not going to show up, they don't call. So you might see more calls than that and from the police side of things. But you mentioned overtime. Spokane is obviously really, really tight right now for their budget. Do they anticipate, if this trend continues, adding more stress to their already stressed budget?
The administration and from what the fire chief has said so far, they're confident that they have enough money allocated in the next biennium for overtime. Now, that's $3.2 million. I wasn't able to find out how much they allocated over the last 2 years, but they're confident that's enough. Now, Councilmember Michael Cathcart, who's among the council's conservative majority, he has his doubts. The city has historically underfunded the fire department's overtime budget. They've had issues with this repeatedly, which he cited, particularly in the last few years. And his suggestion is that they take care of this issue now rather than trying to fill the hole later. But that ultimately didn't happen because the city passed its budget for the next 2 years last month. So unless they amend that moving forward, if issues pop up, it's going to stay at $3.2 million for now.
One of the things in reading your story, I saw that really stuck out to me was just this massive increase in arson calls. How much did that weigh into the added activity?
Yeah, she noted that as a big increase. She actually didn't provide direct data on the arsons, but Police Chief Kevin Hall did. He provided me with a sheet showing that despite having 86 arson incidents, which is a lot in 2023, that number shot up to 124 in 2024, which is a 44% annual increase. Oberg said it's one of the reasons that they were so busy this past year was just dealing with structure fires. She said in December alone, her department responded to 48 structure fires.
There's a lot for a city the size of Spokane. Spokane's not a small town, but at the same time, that is a ton of arson calls for a fire department to have to deal with. And if you've ever known a firefighter or have any familiarity with the process, a structure fire is a massive undertaking. There's so much around it. It's fascinating stuff. Thank you, Tim. And a big thank you to our journalists for sharing their stories. Stay up to date with these and more at thecentersquare.com. I'm Cole Lauterbach. And until next time, this has been Washington in Focus.